Okay, we're ready to get started. If everybody could come into the presentation area, at least everyone who wants to hear the presentations, as well as the presenters. Oh. Okay. Welcome to the third Waterways Specific Here For You session. Our focus tonight is going to be on giving you some updates on some of the outstanding questions and issues that have surfaced. Apologies, first of all, for the amount of time it's been since the last Waterways session. I know we committed to come back to you sooner, and then in fact we delayed the scheduled presentation last week, and that was because we needed some answers from our politicians, and we wanted to have those answers for you before we came back to speak to you. So we have those answers now, and you'll hear about that tonight in the presentations. As usual, we have a number of presentations lined up for you. What isn't usual is we've changed the format a little bit so that instead of the formal Q&A after the presentations where you have to get up and speak to the mic, we asked you to tell us what your biggest concern was or your biggest question when you came in. And we've gathered that feedback and we're taking it to create facilitated tables with experts after the sessions. So when we finish up the presentations, I'll announce to you what the facilitated table sessions will be, what the topics will be, and you can choose the one that you want to go to, or you can float around from one to the other, or you can do none of that. You can just talk to some people that are in the room. There are lots of municipal experts here. All of us have these name tags on the municipal lanyards. So hopefully this new format meets your needs, and if it doesn't, feel free to tell us. We're open to feedback, but we just wanted to try something a little bit different. For the online audience, there won't be opportunity for you to directly ask and have answered questions after the presentation, so we're asking you to email recovery@rmwb.ca, and then we'll get back to you with reply during the session, and if we don't have a specific answer to a detailed question, we'll commit to getting back to you as soon as possible. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Dana, and then each of the presenters will introduce themselves as they come up to the mic. And again, no Q&As during the session, and we'll meet at the tables over coffee afterwards. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Brenda. I appreciate it. My name is Dana Woodworth. I'm the wildfire recovery team leader. I use the word recovery, but the group here that's speaking tonight is not all recovery. It's the RMWB. So it's your government. It's a composite kind of cross-selection of people from engineering, from planning and development, obviously recovery, and other disciplines. Dave is here as well for legal. So the point I want to make is there is no single department or division within your government that has all the answers to all the complexities that you face, in particular with waterways. I think it's important we recognize that. The first thing I want to do is I want to say I apologize. I recognize that we were supposed to be here a week ago, and for my own belief, it's far more preferable to have done that. But the reality is, had we continued down the path, had we picked that date and stood here, a week earlier with you, I would have had far less to say with certainty. I don't think I would have actually given you the type of information and the type of detail that you're seeking. And I don't think it would have been a good move. So it was a conscious and deliberate decision to pause by a week, to allow the democratic process to unfold, to allow mayor and council to consider some fairly hefty decisions based on input from other orders of government, such as the government of Alberta. And the consequence is we were delayed by a week, and I recognize that. So, but having said that, I think we're in a better position to give you facts versus conjecture or simply I don't know, which doesn't help you. The other thing I want to point out, not every community within the region is the same. We recognize that. I've talked briefly about complexity before. Waterways is probably the most complex community post-wildfire to consider. The policy decisions, the rebuild itself, the coordination aspects are much tougher. It comes with more perils, more hazards, and you know that better than I do. So you have a flood hazard area which is mapped, which is established, publicly posted by the government of Alberta, and that presents its own risks to the people that live there that you're aware of. Then you have a fire that cuts across your community and does substantial damage to waterways. So now you have the consequence of a wildfire overlaid on a pre-existing hazard, which has some hard thinking around it and some policy decisions to do the right things when you rebuild. So I want you to know that. We don't believe waterways is in any way simple or a cookie cutter. It's actually very complex and probably the most demanding community to consider. What we want to do, what we have been trying to do since August, is even July, is to give you certainty, to give you choices around, yes, you can rebuild, and how, and to do it in a manner where you can make those decisions in a relatively timely way. So everything that's been occurring, the conversations between the RMWB and the government of Alberta, listening to you, trying to understand the choices, and positioning advice for decision makers such as mayor and council, has been about providing you more and more certainty. And I want you to know that that is our intent. It's not our intent to confuse you. It's not our intent to create more barriers. I would say it's the exact opposite. We're trying to simplify a complex situation, trying to provide you more certainty in a timely manner so you can make informed decisions. We know that you only have one shot at deciding how you're going to spend your money. We've had those conversations at length around the policy tables. We know that. So you want to be in the most informed position possible when you make that decision. I have 2 slides, and I'll take maybe 5 minutes just to speak to them. And they're just a bit of context. So I'm going to cast our minds back in time, back to September 8th. We had a Here For You session, and we arrived with some broad ideas, rebuild, perhaps internal land swap, external land swap, and we listened. We left that first session with a better understanding of what you were interested in. And the vast majority were, in all the feedback we've had to date, the vast majority are remaining interested in rebuild. So we've listened to that. You did also raise at that point, the residents raised the concept of a buyout. So we went back and looked at that. September 27th, your mayor and council debated. There were delegates. They decided and they waived certain fees, which will be discussed in an upcoming slide. That was done to give you an ease of rebuild, recognizing the financial burdens that the entire community is facing, but those in particular who were directly affected by the wildfire. Your government is trying to give you a way to come home quicker, and maybe in a less financially painful manner, frankly. October 4th, they repealed the floodproofing bylaw, 13032. And what that meant was you have a choice when you rebuild in a flood hazard area. You can, at the individual level, you can flood-proof your home. You can also collectively, at an area level, you can flood-proof a community. Or you could do both. So the intent would be, well, do we have belt and suspenders, or do we just need suspenders for the area? And the thinking was and has been that the rebuild is still being considered as a primary driver. It's on the table. Let's give them yet more certainty. We're going to allow them to rebuild. We're not going to force the belt-style individual home protection for flooding. We're going to put something in place that protects the region, the suspenders. So that's why that was removed. So again, it removed a mandatory financial burden, and it's your decision, by the way. It doesn't mean you don't want to or you can't flood-proof at the individual level. You may want to and choose to, but the government's not telling you you must. The decision would rest with you. So the areas below the 250-meter elevation were also included in the wildfire recovery overlay. and they repealed the section that said you couldn't build below the 248-meter contour. So these are very precise elevations and tied to a flood map. And the final piece on the hazard area was rebuilding a floodway or flood fringe is inherently risky. Therefore, the owners need to acknowledge the risk by signing a save harmless agreement and registered on title. And David will talk to that at length, the actual rationale, why that occurred and what the intent is. But all of that was an effort to remove obstacles to your thinking and your decision making, to make it easier for you to come home, to decide you want to build, and then to actually do it. So the extension of overlay bylaw 16020 to waterways into the flood hazard area was introduced as part 11 of the land use bylaw. It applies to the wildfire damaged areas, including waterways, and it repealed 0736, and it gave direction in the residential districts in particular. Gives you certainty for those owners that want to rebuild on the same footprint, you can. So it took away, frankly, it took away a fair bit of discretionary use that the development officers and the compliance officers would typically have in waterways, and it pointed them towards more permitted uses of the land. Therefore, it gave you, frankly, again, more certainty and an easier path to return to your community. It expanded the range of rebuilding options for owners that propose a different footprint as well. And I think it's important to recognize, again, the intent was consistent with Abbotsand and Beacon Hill. It was exactly the same consistent model. We believed then and we believe now that the vast majority of you want to rebuild. We're trying to find the ways to allow you to do that with certainty and to mitigate the risks that are surrounding the flood hazard area. October 13th, we were again here for you. And the details of that engagement session will be included in the next slide. And the final piece on that first slide would be flood mitigation, which I won't speak to. It rests in the hands of the engineering department. Obviously, it predates the fire, but it's an obvious overlay that you can't ignore in waterways or the Lower Town site for that matter. So, next slide. The demolition was completed. Significant progress, in fact, in your entire region for the demolition. You know, sometimes when you're in it, seriously in it, you don't see the change. When I arrived here early August, there had been very, very few loads taken to your landfill. I mean very little. You could count them, under 100. Thousands in the subsequent months moved from all the damaged areas in your community. And I do need to caution you that the kind of the rapidity and the speed with which the debris removal happened is typical. It's easier to do debris removal when you get into a large disaster because you can have the ability to coordinate. So we had a centralized approach with a prime contractor with specs. I know some had heartburn with that, but the reality was that approach, if you think about the amount of coordination effort required, it greatly diminished in the amount of contractors on the landscape, and their ability to plan and to move quickly was reinforced. Now, when we rebuild, it won't be that way, and it typically isn't. You have your own contract with an insurance company. You will make your own decisions, not only if you rebuild, where, how, and who you hire as a contractor is your decision. Governments don't get in between those types of contracts. It's very rare, and it's certainly not the plan here. But what it does mean is instead of a centralized prime, you're likely to have far more contractors on the same landscape doing the rebuild. So there's a coordination challenge for rebuild that's exacerbated by that, but it's about respecting your own individual choices as residents. You need to know that. And we're aware of it, and we're planning for a rebuild plan and a framework to make sure we do it in a manner that is safe, that is efficient and compliant. We are going to create teams that know you, that actually have a geographical attachment. So there will be a team, a construction management team, which will have the tools to actually do it safely, effectively, and compliantly, that will actually spend significant time in your community. And they'll be coordinated through recovery, and they will have a whole suite of tools to make sure that the rebuild happens in a manner that makes sense and is well coordinated. So you need to know that. October 24th was the re-entry of the standing buildings. Significant date when Chief Medical Officer of Health did lift the final restrictions, which was a long time coming, but again, it was about a balance between getting you home quickly, but getting you home safely. To date, we have over 350 permits that have been issued, 160 housing starts, and 9 permits in particular for waterways. There's a slope stability geotechnical study underway, and I'm sure some of you will be interested in understanding the status of that study It'll be spoken to here tonight. There is a waiver. It has been completed, and David will cover it in some detail tonight at a follow-on slide. And the last point I'll raise, the last bullet on the slide in front of you, is Council's recent decision on flood mitigation. So, I talked briefly about choices around, belts, suspenders. Frankly, your mayor and council, your elected officials have made a very clear statement, a very clear decision that they want to protect waterways up to the 1 in 100 standard, which would achieve disaster recovery program backstop from the government of Alberta. And they made a decision recently in council, in public, it was December 13th. So that has given direction, not warm and fuzzy, hey, maybe look at this. That has actually given direction, your mayor and council, to the administration to do it. So the engineering department will now do the pre-design and design and look at the technical solutions to achieve a 1 in 100 standard for flood protection, which in the current flood mapping model is the elevation is 250 meters. What I want to share with you is the government of Alberta has tried very hard to bolt on more certainty around the decision making, to give more clarity and choice, to the extent that even as they know over time flood mapping changes, and they admit that, and even as they admit that they're doing an ongoing study for waterways, that's not unusual, they will grandfather the community in the disaster recovery program to the existing map, which is a 250-meter elevation at 1 in 100. So they're not going to pull the rug out 2 or 3 years from now for decisions that are taken today, monies that are spent on area-wide flood protection. They will respect that. That's enough for me. I'll leave you with a thought. It's not easy, and sometimes when you look at me, he's a bureaucrat, he's a guy standing on the other side of the mic, he doesn't get it. I admit I don't get your exact kind of personal situation, but I will share this with you. I care. I really do care about your situation. We want to make it better for you on a daily basis, and the team that's working on the 5th floor in the Jubilee does care, and we don't take the responsibilities lightly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome here, and thank you very much for taking the time to come out on a cold, frosty Fort McMurray evening. My name is Ray Cruikshank, and this evening I'd like to share with you some information about flood mitigation. This is something that has been going on for a while, and there are some updates I think you'll be interested in. This Tuesday, December the 13th, the Regional Municipality of Wood Buffalo Council passed a motion directing administration to advance flood mitigation development, and in particular, 4 strategies will be ongoing simultaneously. They are, and they're on the screen, first one is to proceed with the pre-design, design, and construction of flood mitigation to a 250-meter elevation with a serious look at demountable wall structure. Now we hear about 250 meters, and what does that really mean? This is the elevation above mean sea level measured in meters. So 250 meters is thought at this point in time to be high enough to give us protection against a 1 in 100 year flood. That's pretty good. Also at this height, the provincial government has stated eligibility for the disaster recovery program will be maintained, and as Dana was suggesting earlier, even if that criterion would be changed, it will still be grandfathered, so we're working with a good number at 250. However, going further, administration has been directed to make allowance for an additional 1 meter height of design, just to have that flexibility for the future. Remembering initially 248.5 was thought to be a good number, and that was sufficient. And then after 2013, after we had the June flood, then the provincial government required a 1 in 100 year protection. So that being the 250 height. Okay, moving on to the next slide. The third strategy approved by Council is to provide temporary measures up to 248.5 until the permanent measures are put in place. These temporary measures can include a variety of responses like sandbagging, for example, perhaps using other materials like pushing earth for temporary dikes or inflatable tubes. It's important to note that any elevation right now, even today, that's at the 248.5 meter level is expected to withstand a 1 in 40 year ice jam flood event. In addition, and we've asked just to go a little further. In addition, we've gained approval for ice renting equipment to be rented, ice breaking equipment to be rented during the 2017 flood season. Now, as you know, a common cause of flooding is ice jamming. The ice piles up, the water can't flow, and the water overflows the banks. This ice breaking equipment breaks the ice up into little bits, smaller pieces that can more easily flow away, thus preventing this type of ice jamming and flooding. I've personally seen this type of equipment actually in work since 2006, where it's been used in the city of Winnipeg very successfully. We'll move on to a map now. This particular map shows the planned alignment of the 250-meter flood structure. For description, we illustrate reaches or lengths along the flood protection area. So starting with reach number 6, as you can see on the left side, that goes around Prairie Loop Boulevard. Reach number 7 parallels Franklin. Reach 8 comes behind Longboat Landing, and Reach 9 backstops the lower town site. All of those are important, and we have Reach 1 to 5 that is off the page, and it actually starts over at Borealis Park and moves this way. Reach 10 runs around Ptarmigan Court and also parallels Saline Creek Parkway from where Saline Creek Parkway starts at Prairie Loop Boulevard and on to Park Street. Reach 11 parallels Saline Creek Parkway from Park Street to Draper Road. We think that by dividing the work up into segments like this, we can probably expedite the work, get the design done faster, get the construction done faster, and we could hopefully have simultaneously things going on at the same time. So we'll move to the next slide there. If a number of flood mitigations have already been put into place, the work done reflects the 1 in 40 year level, which was previously the acceptable level. We're now moving toward targeting a 1 in 100 year level. For example, flood remediation work after the June 13th flood increased the level of protection around the Hanging Stone River. And I think we've all seen that, how it was remediated and brought back to a better level for protection than it was before. Secondly, the construction of Saline Creek Parkway, which is built, is now providing a 1 in 40 year flood barrier. Paralleling the Clearwater River, of course, but aligned with, it is Saline Creek Parkway. Moving forward, investigations into options for getting to the 1 in 100 year level are being studied right now, including a demountable wall structure. In the end, the best solution might be a combination of structures, including berms, permanent walls, and demountable walls, for example. So on this slide, we see a demountable wall. Why the interest in that approach? It has been well understood from community engagements that an unobstructed access and an unimpeded view of the Clearwater River is important, and I couldn't agree more. The demountable wall placed on grade level foundation can provide that type of access. It can be constructed to a variety of heights. The posts and slats are removed when they're not in use, leaving only the grade beam, which could be set at grade height. This may be the only option that's there when you need it and not there when you don't. So moving on to this next slide, we have now the provincial government and council agreement for the elevation to use for further design, that being 250 meters. The next step is to develop specifications for engagement of a qualified system designer. And in addition, We will conduct a thorough geotechnical investigations to determine the structural capability of the existing geology. From these two steps, the structural viability of various options can be calculated, and we will continue to bring information and seek opinions of the community as this information becomes available. Thank you very much for your interest and attention. Good night.
Good evening. My name is Dave LaFleur. I'm the Director of Legal and Legislative Services for the municipality, and I'm going to take just a few minutes to go over with you an aspect of all of this that has generated some questions and hopefully bring some clarity to it. So when the time comes for you as a resident of Waterways to apply for a development permit, which you will need if you've had a total destruction of your home by fire, to apply for a development permit to rebuild, and if you happen to be within the flood hazard zone of Waterways, which has been discussed earlier by a previous speaker or two, you're going to find that as a condition of a development permit, you'll be asked to sign 3 different documents. One is called a waiver, one is called a restrictive covenant, and the other is called a development agreement. And what I'm going to do is start by just explaining briefly in general where the idea of these documents came from, and then I'll briefly go through what each document essentially is all about, what it accomplishes. So first of all, as a general thing, when the decision was made by council to allow rebuilding in Waterways, there were other options, right? But council did decide ultimately that it wanted to facilitate rebuilding in Waterways. And in particular, council decided it wanted to facilitate that rebuilding so much that it was going to remove previously existing provisions in the land use bylaw that required all new building, which a rebuild essentially is, to be built to higher standards of flood proofing, which would be more expensive. We heard back that for a lot of residents in Waterways, they wouldn't have insurance coverage for that extra cost of rebuilding to flood-proof standards, which their previous home, now destroyed by fire, was not built to. So council decided that they were going to facilitate rebuilding in Waterways as much as they could. First of all, to allow it, to make it essentially a permitted use. That was the importance of this overlay bylaw. And then finally to remove the flood proofing requirements. So that sort of gave the green light to people to go into Waterways. The concern then arose, or basically arose at the same time, that okay, if we do that, are we exposing the municipality, and by extension the whole group of taxpayers from other areas, are we exposing them to potential liability on the ground that, you know, we're allowing people into an area that we know is risky to build? And so the way this has been addressed is to say, look, we're going to allow you to do all these rebuildings and facilitate that, but we are going to require you to acknowledge in writing that you know that you're building in an area that is higher risk, right? It's prone to flooding. Okay, but the historic record shows that, right? That's why we speak of, you know, 1 in 40, 1 in 100-year floods that can be very destructive. Okay, so that's where the first document came from, the waiver document. It's basically, if you look at it, and by the way, I should have mentioned at the beginning, I will now, at the back of the room, anyone who wants can get copies of all of these documents, and in addition, a little fact sheet that explains kind of in bullet form, layman language, what they're all about, okay? So I encourage any of you who is interested in that to pick these up on your way out or during a break or whatever. Okay, so back to where I was. So the waiver document essentially is just basically an acknowledgement that you, the existing landowner, the person who's applying right now, today, to rebuild your home, acknowledges that this is an area that that carries with it the risk of flooding, and that you, well, I'll be very blunt, that you won't sue the municipality later if sure enough there's a flood, okay? It's really as simple as that. The development agreement and the restrictive covenant, you are signing them now, you're being asked to sign them, but they really more envision the situation of a future potential purchaser. The municipality is saying, look, you know, we can't get someone who we don't even know right now who they are, who might buy might buy one of these properties in 3 years. We can't very well get them to sign a waiver. We don't know who they are. What we can do is ask the present owner to sign documents that equally acknowledge the risk and documents that we are legally entitled to register on the title to your land. That way, we will have a measure of assurance that any potential future purchaser who will search your title, or their lawyer will find these documents, and they will be duly warned that this is an area that carries potential risk, okay? Now, the documents do certain specific things as well. The development agreement is a covenant that you will not sue the municipality for any disturbance or noise or inconvenience during the construction phase of these walls or berms that Ray just talked about. And the restrictive covenant also says that you agree that in rebuilding, you're not going to cover your whole property with asphalt or, you know, something that will promote flooding of surrounding properties. You're going to maintain a certain amount of natural landscaping where water can seep in as opposed to flow off, that sort of thing. There's no financial burden on you on any of these documents. No one's asking you to pay any money. You're just basically being asked to acknowledge the risk and say that you'll take reasonable measures to cooperate with building the flood berm and the flood wall, and more important than anything, won't sue the municipality because it's allowing you to build in an area that's risky and allowing you to do it in a way that doesn't force you to pay more money than what your insurance company has available to you. So that's basically what they're all about. The last thing I'll say on this topic, and it's probably as important as anything, is that these documents, you've heard me say that 3 or 4 times now, that the primary purpose of them is to be sure that the municipality protects itself against the risk of later claims being made against it for allowing these developments. And so the natural result of that, if you will, the natural corollary of that is that when the municipality has finally finished designing, constructing, implementing its flood mitigation infrastructure and strategy, these documents won't be needed on your title anymore, okay? There still might be a small risk involved to the municipality in removing them from your land titles at that time, but we have looked at it and we're satisfied that once our flood mitigation structures are in place, the risk of not having these things on your title drops so much, is so low, that we can justify voluntarily discharging them from your land title at that time, and that is the municipality's intention. So to sum up, we've got a group of documents that are intended to effectively protect the municipality, and by extension all the other taxpayers, from potential risk of being sued for having allowed you to rebuild. But we're trying to do it in a way that's as little burden, as little inconvenience to you as possible. So we've minimized the documents, minimized their content, and have given you our assurance that they come off your title when the construction of the flood mitigation berm or wall or whatever it may be is finished. So that's basically what I wanted to convey to you. And as with everyone else who's spoken tonight, if you want to stay around after all the presentations and talk to me further, I'm here as long as you need me to be. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave, and good evening, everyone. My name is Erin O'Neill, and I'm the Operations Manager for the Recovery Task Force. So we have had a number of questions about overhead and underground utilities. So electrical power service is provided by ATCO Electric in Fort McMurray under a franchise agreement that they have with the municipality. Now, early on in our recovery, overhead was selected as the path forward for the waterways area based on the following considerations. Now, the considerations that you do see are in order. So there was a possibility that if we did go underground, there was a possibility of a rebuild delay to switch to underground. It would also take additional time to facilitate underground design because we need to obtain in some cases utility rights of way, so there'd be some land acquisition that was part of that, and then the overall cost, the overall cost implication that was included with that. Next slide, thank you. So we did extensively talk to ATCO Electric to see what could be done. Their time to rebuild overhead was about a 1-month process, so that process is nearing completion. They should be done, so if any residents are at the rebuild stage, they can contact ATCO to have their power hooked up now, whereas underground could take 14 to 16 months, thus delaying the rebuild. So what we're doing, as we've heard from a number of residents, is we will be looking at an overall revitalization plan for the waterways area. So could we potentially switch to underground utilities in the future? Could we look at doing upgrading our deep utilities, so our water and sewer, sidewalks, roads, those types of things that don't meet municipal standards now? So we will be looking to engage residents in the future over that, about potentially future revitalization plans that could be done as part of a capital project within the next 3 to 5 years. Next slide, please. So at the September 8th Here For You session, we heard from a number of residents living in the Cliff Avenue area. What do they need to do there are some slope concerns in that area. What do they need to do? As they knew, as part of their development permit, they typically have to submit a geotechnical report. So were they required to do that? What's going to happen? What if they had one done recently? So what the municipality did is we're doing a detailed assessment of the overall area. So this is looking at the slopes within the area to see if there's any potential slope stability issues that have been caused as a result of the fire. The contractor that we hired will come back and identify any mitigation measures that are required and be able to recommend any slope setback distances. That assessment is currently underway. Likely you've seen some geotechnical work being done in that area, and it's to be submitted by the end of January. So the land use bylaw, as I mentioned, it does require that in an area where there's slope concerns that you submit a geotechnical report when you apply for the permit. Now, the overall geotechnical report that the city is doing may not take away the requirement for that site-specific geotechnical. What it will do is it will provide your geotechnical additional information, thus likely reducing the cost and maybe taking away the entire requirement for that geotechnical. We did identify 3 areas. We did an early review investigation of this area in September. We did some visual inspections of it to see what the concerns were. So there are 3 areas that we have identified in that slope stability area. So area A and area B are considered to be a high priority areas given what's existing, the height of the slopes in that area. So we are doing additional drilling and investigation in that area. We have installed slope monitoring equipment so that we can really understand what is happening in that area and if there's any change over time. Area C is of lower priority. There was less impact realized when we did that investigation. So what we are doing is just maintaining the investigation in that area and maintaining the monitoring in that area to make sure there's no concerns. And at this point, I will hand it over to Planning and Development to answer some of those questions.
Thanks, Aaron. My name is Jamie Doyle. I'm the Director of Planning and Development. What I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this evening is planning, the area redevelopment plan, and the land use bylaw. Waterways is included in the City Centre Area Redevelopment Plan under Section 5.5.8. This policy provides direction to allow for a mix of low-rise forms of housing while also encouraging mixed-use commercial corridors along Bullier Avenue and Railway Avenue. Planning through consultation will work towards implementing updated zoning as part of the larger land use bylaw amendment process. Next slide, please. The municipality is currently in the process of resurveying Abasand, Beacon Hill, and Waterways. On-site investigations for waterways are complete, and the information is currently being compiled and drafted into a plan. The municipality is also working with the province to reestablish survey monuments that were destroyed or are missing. Through the cleanup process, many of these monument pins were lost. The municipality is also in the process of working with the province under the Minister of Environment and Parks and the Director of Surveys to reestablish these survey monuments. And finally, to date, planning has received 15 development permits on waterways. 9 of those permits were issued.
Thanks, Jamie. So as stated earlier, at the September 8th engagement session, we did come to residents to see what they wanted for their community. We did consistently hear that a number of residents wanted to rebuild in that area, but what residents did put on the table through an informal survey process was the possibility of a buyout. So we have been investigating that, and Mayor and Council's approval of the long-term flood mitigation strategy this past Tuesday night implies that there will be no buyout for any or all of the properties within the flood hazard area. The Wood Buffalo Recovery Committee and the task force will not be entertaining buyouts, and residents within the flood hazard area are encouraged to rebuild, and this has now provided certainty to residents about the rebuilding. The approval of that flood mitigation has provided residents with some certainty about what is going to happen in the future for that area, and it's not possible for the municipality to do a combination of a buyout and flood mitigation. So that motion by council this past Tuesday night has signaled to rebuild. As Dana mentioned earlier, talking about the rebuild plan, so over 226 properties were destroyed in waterways. So as you can imagine, the coordination of rebuilding for this area is difficult, much like all of our destroyed areas. So it's not a new challenge to Fort McMurray for rebuilding, but what's been done in the past is typically we do buildings in newer subdivisions, so where the developer has full control over those areas. Typically Fort McMurray has never seen this level of rebuild in established areas or infill development, so that creates another coordination challenge where there's individuals living in there, possible schools being open, what the construction routes are, those types of things. So as we mentioned, we're looking at a construction management team, and that would see a coordinator for each of the areas. So the waterways area would be combined with a coordinator for Anzac and Sapere Creek, and that person would essentially become your expert for the area. You become your expert for your contractors, for the residents, and to make sure that there's eyes on the ground for that enforcement type of piece, so we can work with our safety codes officers and our development compliance officers to make sure that things are progressing along safely, efficiently, and compliantly. So as we alluded to earlier, we just wanted to provide you an update on fees. So as many of you know, at the September 27th council meeting, council made a number of motions regarding fees. So the first one, they have waived all the fees for development and building permits specific to the properties destroyed or damaged by the wildfire. So for residents that have already applied for permits and paid those fees, those rebate checks will be issued to you. If you apply online, you will be paying those fees right now, but those checks will be also returned to you within 6 to 8 weeks. And if you go into our planning and development office and apply for your permits, those fees will be waived right away, so there will be no cost at that point. What we did learn during this process was that we became the owner of a lot of concrete throughout this process. So our landfill now has a large amount of crushed concrete at the landfill. Now that crushed concrete can be used for future infrastructure projects. So since we gained that asset, what we are doing, rather than us having to buy it in the future for road building projects and those types of things, now that we have that asset, we are issuing a rebate check to every property owner, regardless if you had a foundation or not, in the amount of $540, and those checks will be sent out to those property owners in the coming weeks. We do have a number of instances of fire break properties. So fire break is defined as a property that was demolished prior to ignition. So those were properties that were used as a fire break. Some refer to those as the bulldoze properties. So those people experienced excess fees when they were taking their demolished structures to the landfill. Rather than taking ash and debris to the landfill, they were taking larger construction materials, walls that hadn't been completely destroyed, those types of things. So they did experience excess fees. So council did approve the payment of additional fees to those people so we could make them whole and make them on the same pace as some of the properties that were destroyed by fire. We do have those specific details that we can give you tonight. You can ask one of us, we can get you those details, but we are working, we have validated all the fire break properties now, and we will be sending letters out to all of those people saying what those excess fees are. Geotechnical, as we stated, this is underway, so there was talk that those costs may be borne by the property owner. That overall site investigation, we are bearing that cost, so that will ultimately decrease the cost for the homeowner. As Jamie mentioned, the monument pins and survey pins are being reestablished, and while this won't take away the need for that site plan or overall survey plan, what it will do is it will decrease the cost of your survey plan, because we are reestablishing those survey pins that were destroyed during the demolition process. And then grading plans for the areas of Abassan, Beacon Hill, and Waterways are underway. Specifically, since these are older areas of town, we needed to determine what the actual grade is for rebuilding, so when you submit your permit, we can confirm that there's positive drainage in those areas. So we are doing that overall plan to help out with that process as well. And with that, I will hand it over to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Sarah Morant. I'm the Manager of Stakeholder Engagement for the Wood Buffalo Recovery Task Force. Happy to bring you a bit of an update on the public engagement process to date, and further state my commitment and the commitment of the team that I work with to engaging with residents. Also the commitment of our elected officials through Mayor and Council, the Wood Buffalo Recovery Committee, the task force, and our entire administration do have a strong commitment to engaging with residents whenever possible. A strong example of this organization's commitment to that is the recent passing of a new public engagement policy, which was done on October 18th at Council. We also understand and recognize as a team, as an organization, as a group at large, that public engagement is not a one-size-fits-all field, and that not every technique that we may use fits every person at every different situation. This is why we've aimed to, and will continue to aim to, and I'll always welcome your feedback on different public engagement techniques and tactics that you're familiar with, to use a wide assortment of different approaches whenever possible. Through the International Association of Public Participation, more commonly known as IAP2, the engagement has a spectrum that ranges from inform, which would be something like tonight, an information presentation where residents, stakeholders can obtain information in an open format. And then it goes to the opposite side of the spectrum, which would be empower. It's when a governing body or an organization places the decision-making power in its residents. So an example of that would be in a municipal government would be something like a referendum or a resident-driven vote, if you will, and that would generally, as a rule, be done on decisions that would have an impact on all ratepayers in a designated region. So that just gives you an idea of both ends of the spectrum. To date, in recovery, we've launched the Here For You campaign, and that came from resident feedback. So this is not something that was created by a team of experts. It came from an ask and a requirement of you, of our community, back in early August when you created and made us aware of the need to be reaching out to you and answering questions, hearing from you. And from that point, over 30 different Here For You sessions have been held, each one with an evolution and a slight shift based on your feedback and the way that you wanted to be communicated with and talked to and engaged with. So we've also and other opportunities to engage with the public in general are, of course, through Tuesday night council meetings at council chambers, Wednesday night through Wood Buffalo Recovery Committee meetings, which do happen bi-weekly, again at council chambers at Jubilee. You can participate in municipal focus groups through some of your stakeholder groups. Sometimes we wear different hats. We're not just a resident, but we may be part of an organization. So there's other ways to participate through that. Online, of course, you can do things like email through recovery@rmwb, obtain countless amounts of information through social media and municipal website. And for anyone who's not online and still wants to play a role, you can, of course, contact the Pulse line. In the earlier days of re-entry and in the response stage, of course, we had telephone town halls, which were a great approach for regional reach, and again, something that we could always go back to using if there was a need for it. So there's lots of different ways. Those are just honestly a tiny snippet, and we do look forward to shaping our approach and our style based on your feedback, and many more opportunities to continue to engage with you in the future. One more reminder, it is for our online audience, and I know some of you may have just joined the presentation throughout. We're not doing a formal question period from social media questions tonight, so we are asking that you do email through to recovery@rmwb.ca. All emails that we receive during this session will be responded to. We do have a dedicated team of staff that are responding to that tonight. What we have heard, the reason for making that decision, what we've heard from maybe some people that are watching right now or some in the room is that a lot of people don't like to ask their questions on social media because they are then self-identified. Some of us, we don't mind having our names associated with our questions, and other people have a slightly different level of privacy when it comes to the questions they're asking. So they've asked for an alternative way to communicate. So that is to answer that need. So please email through to Recovery. It'll also ensure that you're going to get the answer that you looked for. So if you ask a question through social media and I stand here and answer it, I don't know if you're still there watching because you might have tuned out, the computer could have froze, something could have happened, and this way at least you can always go back and reread an email and we can ensure that you get the information that you need most. So thank you. With that, I'll pass it off to Brenda to finish things off.
Thanks, Sarah. So that's the end of our formal presentations this evening. As we talked about earlier, we're now going to break out into the 4 facilitated groups. I hope you find it useful. I know that the table I was at, excuse me, in the last session, we had a really fruitful discussion, and I think may have come to some different conclusions, or at least might look at things a little differently because of that. So the tables we have set up based on your feedback when you came in the door as to what's most important to you are flood mitigation and land use, development and planning, engineering, so on. Over here we've got the legal waiver and those encumbrances type of discussion. And then the next table over is about communication, engagement, how you get your information, what information you're not getting, how you'd like us to do this differently, all those kinds of things. And or maybe, just if you're not interested in the other 3 tables, then show up at the communications one and we'll listen to you there. All right, so thank you very much for coming, and please do stick around. If you don't want to go to a table, there's lots of other people here who can talk to you, listen to your questions, etc.